Tonight, we journey into the life and mind of Vincent van Gogh, the Dutch painter whose art, madness, and relentless passion made him one of history's most misunderstood geniuses. From luminous starry nights to tragic endings, his story is one where brilliance clashed with pain, and beauty was born out of suffering. His legacy continues to stir hearts, inspire artists, and challenge the way we define success and failure. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. If you enjoy our stories, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes these stories might keep you awake. Other times they might gently lull you to sleep. Now dim the lights, let the soft hum of your fan fill the room, and come with me as we step into the quiet, colorful world of Vincent van Gogh. Vincent Willem van Gogh was born on March 30, 1853, in the small Dutch village of Zundert. His birth came with a haunting shadow. Exactly 1 year earlier, his parents had lost a stillborn son, also named Vincent. They buried that child, and when their next baby arrived, they gave him the same name. Growing up, the young Vincent knew that just beyond the church, a tombstone bore his name and an almost identical birth date. For a child, that knowledge must have been both strange and heavy, a silent reminder of absence and fate. He was the eldest of 6, born to Theodorus van Gogh, a Protestant minister, and Anna Cornelia Carbentus, a woman who loved nature and sketching. The family lived simply, their world shaped by faith and discipline. From an early age, Vincent seemed different, sensitive, quiet, easily lost in thought. He often wandered the countryside alone, staring at the fields and the sky, drawn to the quiet poetry of nature. It spoke to him in a language he could understand, even when people could not. School was never a place where he thrived. Though bright and curious, he struggled to fit in, to find ease among his classmates. Some thought him difficult, others thought him kind but distant. But even then it was clear he was not like other children. He saw the world differently, deeply, painfully, beautifully. His younger brother, Theo, would become his dearest friend and emotional anchor, a bond that would sustain him through years of turmoil and isolation. In his youth, Vincent was restless. He tried to find his place in the world, to live the kind of respectable life others expected of him. His uncle, an art dealer, helped him find work at a firm called Goupil & Cie, first in The Hague, then in London, and later in Paris. Surrounded by art and the business of beauty, he should have found joys, but instead he felt hollow. To him, this world of buying and selling art stripped it of its soul. He grew disillusioned, melancholy, and eventually lost his job. In London, he fell in love and was rejected. The heartbreak, combined with his growing sense of failure, turned him inward. He began to seek purpose in faith, training briefly as a minister, and later working as a missionary in a poor mining region of Belgium known as the Borinage. Among the miners and their families, Vincent gave away his possessions, lived in poverty, and tried to emulate the compassion of Christ. But the church saw his devotion as excessive and dismissed him. It was another loss, another closed door. But from that darkness, something began to bloom. He started sketching. The miners, their faces, their hands, their lives. He drew not with precision, but with empathy. His art became a way to understand human suffering, and perhaps to soothe it. At 27, after years of failure and rejection, Vincent made a quiet but life-altering choice. He would become an artist. Not for fame, not for fortune, but because he had to. Art was his language, his therapy, his way of turning inner chaos into something others might see as beautiful. There was no sudden success. No applause. Only long, grinding effort. He had no formal training, no connections, and little money. Theo began sending him small sums so he could buy paints and survive. Vincent studied obsessively, anatomy, perspective, technique, and copied the works of old masters while developing his own voice. His early paintings were dark and heavy, full of browns, blacks, and greys. He painted peasants, workers, and the poor, people whose lives mirrored his own struggles. One of his first great works, The Potato Eaters, captured a family gathered around a dimly lit table, their hands rough and faces weary. It was raw, honest, and painfully human. Critics dismissed it as crude, but Vincent believed it told the truth. "I want to touch people with my art," he once wrote. "I want them to say he feels deeply, he feels tenderly. Despite rejection and poverty, He kept painting. His health faltered, his body weakened, but his spirit grew stronger. Every brushstroke became a lifeline. He was learning to speak through color, texture, and silence. Though the world still ignored him, Vincent van Gogh had become what he was meant to be, not a painter of technique, but of truth. By 1886, Vincent arrived in Paris, where his brother Theo was working as an art dealer. The city pulsed with creativity. Impressionism was in full bloom and the air buzzed with new ideas. Here, Vincent discovered light. He abandoned his dark tones and embraced color, vivid yellows, reds, and electric blues. He met artists like Toulouse-Lautrec, Pissarro, and Gauguin, men who would inspire and challenge him. But even in the lively cafes and studios of Paris, Vincent felt like an outsider. He was awkward, intense, and easily overwhelmed. What others saw as a social scene, he saw as noise. He didn't just want to paint what he saw, he wanted to paint what he felt. His art grew bolder, more experimental. He painted himself again and again, not out of vanity, but to explore his own shifting emotions. The city, however, exhausted him. Its pace, its chaos, its relentless energy, it all became too much. In 1888, seeking peace and light, Vincent packed his things and left Paris behind. He boarded a train heading south, toward the quiet warmth of Aix-en-Provence. There, under the sun and endless sky, he would finally begin to see the world not as it was, but as he felt it should be. He imagined Arles as a sanctuary, a new beginning, a place where the warmth of the sun, the endless wheat fields, and the glow of the southern light could soothe his restless soul. He didn't know it then, but this little town in Provence would become both the birthplace of his most iconic masterpieces and the scene of his deepest heartbreak. When Vincent arrived in Arles in February of 1888, the cold Mistral winds swept through the narrow streets. Yet he didn't mind. He had come in search of light, and he knew that soon the landscape would bloom with color. The yellow of the wheat fields, the soft violet of distant mountains, the deep blue of the sky, it was everything he had imagined and more. He rented a small house with sun-colored walls, the now famous Yellow House, and declared it the beginning of his dream. A haven for artists in the south of France. He envisioned a studio of the south, a shared space where painters could live, work, and inspire one another. It was his way of creating the sense of belonging he had always longed for. Vincent believed deeply in community, even though he often struggled within it. After years of loneliness, he craved connection, and Arles felt like the place where it might finally happen. He painted with unstoppable energy. Sunflowers glowing in a vase, fields under heavy, swirling skies, blossoming orchards, starry nights. His brushwork grew alive, confident, pulsing with feeling. He no longer painted what he saw, he painted what he felt. The warmth of the sun became radiant yellow, the quiet of a room transformed into movement and emotion, but beneath the bursts of color, loneliness lingered. He wrote to Theo constantly, about his paintings, his meals, his moods, as if trying to make sense of the storm inside him. Through every letter, you can feel his longing to be understood, his desperate hope that someone somewhere might finally see him for who he was. In the autumn of 1888, his wish seemed to come true. Paul Gauguin, a painter Vincent admired deeply, finally arrived in Arles. Vincent was overjoyed. The dream of his artist community was finally taking shape. He filled the Yellow House with his own paintings, decorated Gauguin's room, and spoke of endless days of shared creativity. At first, it was harmony. Two artists talking late into the night about color, light and art. But soon their differences began to show. Gauguin was confident, proud, and often dismissive. Vincent was sensitive, emotional, and easily hurt. Their personalities clashed like fire and oil. Conversations turned into arguments. Vincent grew anxious, fearful that Gauguin would abandon him, the very thing he dreaded most. Yet even through the tension, he produced some of his most famous works. He painted his sunflowers to welcome Gauguin, bright, burning, alive. But behind those flowers was fragility. His dream of friendship, of a shared creative home, began to crack under the weight of emotion and exhaustion. By the end of 1888, life inside the Yellow House had become unbearable. The joy and excitement had given way to conflict and chaos. Gauguin found Vincent unpredictable and difficult. Vincent felt rejected and desperate. The dream was unraveling. Then, on the night of December 23rd, everything changed. After a heated argument, Gauguin stormed out. Some say he intended to leave Arles for good. According to one version of the story, Vincent followed him into the street, holding a razor in his trembling hand. Gauguin walked away into the night. Alone and spiraling, Vincent returned to the Yellow House, consumed by despair. What happened next remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. In a moment of anguish, Vincent took a blade and cut off part of his left ear. No one knows what drove him: grief, fear, or perhaps an act of desperate control in a world that no longer made sense. He wrapped the ear in paper and brought it to a nearby brothel, giving it to a woman named Rachel. Then he collapsed. The next morning he was found unconscious and taken to the hospital. The story spread quickly through Arles. The mad artist had mutilated himself. Crowds gathered. The newspapers wrote headlines, and Gauguin fled back to Paris. The two would never see each other again. Though Vincent's body began to heal, his mind faltered. He suffered hallucinations, memory lapses, and deep sadness. He wrote to Theo begging for comfort, his letters filled with confusion and regret. Still, he kept painting. Even in the hospital courtyard, he found solace in the small, quiet details of life: a bench, a garden, a patch of sunlight. He painted the courtyard of the hospital in Arles, self-portrait with bandaged ear, and the Red Vineyard, the only painting he ever sold during his lifetime. But something inside him had broken. Not just his health, but his heart. The Yellow House, once his dream sanctuary, now stood empty. The townspeople whispered and kept their distance. Vincent, fragile and misunderstood, knew he could no longer stay, and so with quiet resignation he agreed to be admitted to an asylum. The ear was gone. The friend had left. The dream had faded. But the artist still remained. In May of 1889, Vincent van Gogh entered the Saint-Paul-de-Moselle Asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. The stone building, surrounded by olive trees and wild gardens, had once been a monastery. Now it became his new world, part refuge, part prison. His small room had bars on the windows, but outside the light still called to him. For Vincent, it was a place of both confinement and peace, where even through the pain, his art would continue to bloom. There were long stretches of silence in the asylum, broken only by distant cries echoing down the corridors. Each day moved in quiet rhythm: meals, medicine, short walks, and long hours of rest. But whenever Vincent was well enough, he painted. The staff, recognizing how much it meant to him, gave him a small studio space. There he worked endlessly, almost compulsively. He painted what he could see from his window: tall cypress trees bending in the wind, swirling skies alive with motion, golden fields that shimmered under the sun. He painted the asylum's gardens, the hallways, and the hills that rolled beyond its walls. And in a rare moment of uneasy calm, he painted what would become one of the most famous works in history, The Starry Night. It wasn't meant to be realistic. It was emotional. The sky twists and flows like a river of light, the stars burning like tiny suns over a sleeping village. To Vincent, it was a failure, something that didn't match what he felt inside. But the world would later see it as a masterpiece. Though his mental health rose and fell unpredictably, his creativity never stopped. In the span of a single year, he completed nearly 150 paintings: irises, the olive trees, the bedroom, wheat field with reaper, and many more. Each was a reflection of his inner battle, beauty and despair intertwined, peace and pain sharing the same canvas. But the darkness never fully left him. He suffered terrifying episodes, moments of confusion, panic, and silence so deep he couldn't remember what he had painted. Sometimes he feared his mind was slipping away completely. Once, in a fit of despair, he swallowed paint and turpentine, an act of self-harm that left him weak and trembling. Still, somehow he kept going. Through it all, he wrote to Theo, letter after letter, pouring out his thoughts about color, brushwork, emotion, and hope. He tried to describe what it felt like to fall apart while creating something beautiful, to lose control of his mind, but still find meaning through art. What would life be, he wrote, if we didn't have the courage to try anything? Inside those walls, Vincent van Gogh was a broken man. Yet within that same confinement, he created some of the most powerful art the world would ever know, works that captured not just what he saw, but what he was. A man losing his mind, yet finding his soul in every stroke of the brush. By May of 1890, Vincent left the asylum in Saint-Rémy. His health had improved somewhat, and though fragile, he longed to return to the open world. On his doctor's advice, he moved to a quiet village called Auvers-sur-Oise, just north of Paris. The place was peaceful, and endless skies, winding paths, and golden wheat fields that seemed made for him. Even more comforting, he was close to Theo, his brother, his constant supporter. His lifeline had recently married and become a father. Vincent was genuinely happy for him, but beneath that happiness was a quiet, growing fear. He worried that he had become a burden. The financial strain, the emotional weight, the concern he caused, it all began to weigh heavily on him. His letters changed. Gratitude was still there, but it came mixed with guilt. In Auvers, Vincent came under the care of Dr. Paul Gachet, a physician who shared his fascination with art and melancholy. Vincent painted his portrait twice and once wrote to Theo, half joking, half serious, "He's sicker than I am." Despite his doubts, he worked more intensely than ever. In just 70 days, he painted over 70 canvases, fields under stormy skies, rode with poplars, the church at Auvers, each filled with restless energy and aching emotion. It was as though he knew time was running short. His brush moved faster, his colors bolder, his skies more turbulent. He was pouring everything he had left into the world, every fear, every fragment of beauty, every ounce of pain. And then, one day, it stopped. On July 27, 1890, Vincent walked into a wheat field carrying a revolver. No one knows exactly what was on his mind. Maybe he believed his work was done. Maybe he thought his suffering had gone on long enough. Under the vast summer sky he had painted so many times, he turned the gun on himself and pulled the trigger. He didn't die right away. Wounded, he managed to stagger back to his small room at the inn, where he was found bleeding and taken to bed, fragile, silent, and fading, as if his story was painting its final stroke. Theo rushed to be by his brother's side. The two spoke very little, but they didn't need to. Words had never been necessary between them. Their bond was deeper than conversation, a quiet understanding that had carried them through years of struggle. Vincent, weak and fading, turned to Theo and whispered his final words, "The sadness will last forever." 2 days later, Vincent van Gogh died in his brother's arms. The villagers buried him on a gentle, tree-lined hill in Auvers, surrounded by the golden fields he had painted so often, his final resting place among the landscapes that had both comforted and tormented him. At the time of his death, Vincent was unknown, uncelebrated, and misunderstood. He had sold only a single painting in his lifetime. To most, he was a failed artist, unstable, strange, a man lost in his own mind. The world had turned away from him, never realizing what it was losing. But in that silence, something extraordinary was beginning to take shape. Vincent died believing he had failed. Yet the truth, the legacy he could not see, was already being born. 6 months after his death, Theo too passed away, weakened by illness and grief. He was only 33. He never lived to see what his brother's art would become, how it would one day move millions. But the story didn't end there. It was Theo's wife, Johanna van Gogh Bonger, who carried Vincent's legacy forward. She inherited hundreds of his paintings and the many letters exchanged between the brothers, fragile papers filled with love, pain, and hope. To most they would have seemed worthless, the remnants of a broken life. But Johanna saw something else. She saw truth. She saw beauty. Quietly and patiently, she began to share Vincent's story with the world. She organized exhibitions, published his letters, and worked to show that behind the madness was brilliance, behind the suffering was art that spoke of something deeply human. Piece by piece, the world began to understand. What was once dismissed as insanity became recognized as genius. The art world that had once ignored him began to listen. By the early 1900s, Vincent's work found admirers, then followers, and finally reverence. His paintings were displayed in galleries, his letters were studied, and his influence began to ripple across generations. Artists called him their inspiration. Collectors competed to own his work. Critics rewrote their histories to include his name. And with each passing decade, the light of Vincent van Gogh's only grew brighter. Today, the Starry Night hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, seen by millions every year. Sunflowers is one of the most recognizable paintings in the world. And his letters, tender, poetic, heartbreakingly honest, are read not only as insights into art, but into the human condition itself. But Vincent's legacy isn't confined to galleries or museums. It lives in the way we understand beauty and pain. It's in how we speak about mental health, sensitivity, and the creative spirit. He taught the world that from great suffering can come great art, that even in despair, there can be light. Vincent van Gogh remains one of the most powerful examples of someone who wasn't celebrated in life, but found immortality in death. Beneath a quiet hill in Auvers, he lies beside Theo, two brothers forever united not just by blood but by belief. Theo never stopped believing in Vincent, and now neither have we. From silence came color, from pain beauty, from a lonely life, a voice that still whispers gently across time, reminding us that even the most fragile souls can leave the brightest marks on the world. And just as Vincent transformed sorrow into color, others too would one day turn pain into art, in a different place, with a different sound. The birth of jazz, like Van Gogh's story, rose from struggle and resilience. It didn't come from fame or polished music schools, but from the heart, from communities that carried both suffering and joy in their songs. In the American South, after centuries of slavery and hardship, freedom brought its own battles, racism, poverty, exclusion. Yet in homes, churches, and streets, people created something beautiful. They built community. They built rhythm. They built music. Drums became memory. Voices became history. And out of that shared experience of mourning, celebration, and survival, a new sound began to rise. Jazz was not written down or rehearsed for the stage. It was lived. It was breathed. It was born in backyards and on street corners, in the meeting of gospel and blues, in the blending of African rhythms with European melodies. In New Orleans, the city where jazz would take its first breath, life itself seemed to move with music. Births, weddings, parades, even funerals were filled with rhythm. Out of sorrow came something alive, something beautiful. Just like Vincent's colors, these melodies carried the human spirit forward, proof that even from pain, creation never truly ends. A funeral in New Orleans might begin with slow, mournful hymns, soft voices and heavy hearts, only to burst moments later into bright, joyful brass music as the body was laid to rest. It was a ritual that honored both sides of life, the sorrow of goodbye and the celebration of a life well lived. That delicate balance between heartbreak and joy became the heartbeat of jazz itself. In those early days, the music didn't even have a name. People simply played. They mixed styles, they experimented, they improvised. They followed feeling more than form, instinct more than instruction. And from that raw, untamed expression, a new sound began to take shape, one that couldn't be contained by any rule or definition. It was music that invited mistakes, embraced freedom and lived in the moment. That sound was jazz. Jazz didn't erase sorrow, it danced with it. It didn't ignore hardship, it transformed it. And in that transformation, something deeply human was born. Jazz came from pain, but it carried joy. It carried life. It was living proof that even in the darkest corners of experience, beauty can rise. At the turn of the 20th century, New Orleans was unlike any other place in America. It wasn't just a port city, it was a meeting place, a crossroads of culture, language, and sound. This was where jazz would be born, because nowhere else had quite the same blend of influences. The city was French, Spanish, African, Creole, Caribbean, a place where Catholic prayers mixed with Protestant hymns, where enslaved and free people lived side by side, and where every street seemed to hum with rhythm. Each group that came to New Orleans brought its own stories, instruments, and traditions. And rather than staying separate, these cultures collided and intertwined. In elegant salons, you might hear operas and chamber music drifting through open windows. In Congo Square, African drums thundered as dancers moved to ancestral rhythms passed down through generations. Just a few streets away, gospel choirs filled churches while brass bands rehearsed for parades. Street performers played ragtime on worn pianos, while children learned hymns by ear. Music was everywhere, and more importantly, it was shared. New Orleans was one of the few places in America where people of different races and classes regularly heard and learned from one another. Musicians borrowed rhythms, melodies, and ideas freely. A church spiritual might inspire a street melody. A parade tune could become a blues riff. There were no barriers, only inspiration. Even the city's geography played a part. The neighborhoods were close and lively. Sound carried easily. The call of a cornet or the beat of a drum could drift from one block to the next, drawing others in. A simple tune played on a front porch could turn into a full jam session by evening. Of course, this collision of cultures wasn't without conflict. Segregation and racism were real and brutal. But somehow music found a way around those walls. It became a common language in a divided world, a voice that belonged to everyone. And in New Orleans, that voice kept evolving. Out of its crowded streets and layered histories came something entirely new. Not classical, not folk, not blues, but a sound built from pieces of them all. Improvised, unpredictable and impossible to define, jazz was alive, and only New Orleans could have given it life. Long before jazz had a name, it had a heartbeat. That heartbeat came from Africa. For generations, enslaved Africans brought to America carried with them more than memories. They carried rhythm, tradition, and music. Even in the darkest times, they held on to the sounds of home. In New Orleans, those sounds never died. The most sacred space for them was Congo Square, a patch of land just beyond the French Quarter. Every Sunday, the one-day enslaved people were allowed to rest. They gathered there to drum, sing, and dance. For those few hours, they reclaimed a piece of their freedom. The air filled with call-and-response chants, polyrhythmic drumming, and the energy of bodies moving together, a living connection to ancestry, identity, and dignity. Congo Square was more than a gathering place. It was a pulse, a declaration of life in the face of oppression. Over time, those African rhythms blended with European instruments, fiddles, horns, accordions, and new sounds emerged. The banjo, descended from West African lutes, joined French melodies and Spanish guitar lines. The result was music that couldn't be traced to one single source. It was the child of many worlds, but Africa's influence ran deeper than rhythm or melody. In many West African cultures, music wasn't something separate from life. It was life. It told stories, marked seasons, healed wounds, and united communities. That same spirit infused jazz. From field hollers to work songs, from spirituals to blues, the music of the African diaspora carried emotion like breath. Every note meant something. Every beat had purpose, and from those beats, from that history of struggle, endurance, and hope, the first true voice of jazz began to rise. From the emotional depth of early African rhythms came the birth of something extraordinary, the power of improvisation. It was about expressing emotion in the moment, not through perfection but through honesty. Jazz inherited that language completely. It didn't obey strict rules because life didn't either. It bent, shifted, responded, it felt. Jazz was never about flawless technique. It was about truth. The echoes of Africa gave it a heartbeat and a soul, rhythm that moved the body and emotion that touched the heart. Though jazz took shape in America, its roots reached deep into another continent, and even now, those roots hum beneath every horn, every drum, and every note ever played in its name. In the years after the Civil War, something unexpected happened in New Orleans. The city was filled with leftover instruments, brass horns, clarinets, drums, and tubas, once used by military bands that had since been disbanded. They ended up in pawnshops, attics, and dusty corners of second-hand stores until new hands, curious, untrained, and determined, picked them up and brought them back to life. These weren't classically trained musicians. They were barbers, butchers, shoe shiners, and porters, men and boys who couldn't afford music lessons, but who taught themselves by listening and experimenting. They took those brass instruments and made them speak in ways no one had before. The music that came out wasn't refined or polite. It was raw, loud, and full of spirit. They weren't following sheet music. They were inventing a new language, bending notes, sliding between keys, and blending rhythms that weren't supposed to fit. The cornet became a storyteller's voice. The clarinet sighed and sang like a human voice. The drums kept time, but always with surprise, and the tuba gave everything a deep, steady heartbeat. Every street in New Orleans became a classroom. Marching bands paraded through neighborhoods. Brass quartets played at fish fries, dances, and funerals. Children learned just by watching, listening, and joining in. You didn't need wealth or formal training. All you needed was rhythm. Jazz wasn't born in concert halls. It was born in motion, in the streets, the parades, and the living pulse of the city. Improvisation wasn't just a skill, it was survival. If a player missed a note, they bent another to fill the space. If they didn't know a tune, they made one up that fit. Jazz didn't punish mistakes. It turned them into opportunity. Those discarded instruments of military precision became the tools of personal expression. They no longer marched to orders. They swung, they shouted, they cried with joy and pain. In New Orleans, brass wasn't just metal. It was magic. It was transformation. And soon it would become the sound of a revolution, a new kind of music that would spread from those streets to the world. One of the first sparks came from a man named Charles "Buddy" Bolden, born in New Orleans in 1877. By the late 1890s, he was already making noise, quite literally. Bolden played the cornet, but not like anyone before him. His sound was louder, freer, and more emotional than the city had ever heard. People said, when Bolden played, you didn't just listen, you felt it. He didn't read sheet music or study theory. He played from instinct. Bolden mixed ragtime, blues, gospel, and brass marches into something wild and alive. His music swung, shouted, and mourned. Crowds followed him everywhere. Dance halls filled when he played, and people stayed until dawn, moving to a rhythm that felt entirely new. He became known for a tune called Funky Butt, one of the earliest jazz songs ever performed, raw, fearless, and joyful. What made Bolden special wasn't just his power or volume. It was how human his playing was. His horn laughed, cried, and confessed. It spoke when words couldn't. Sadly, Buddy Bolden's story ended too soon. In 1907, at just 30 years old, he suffered a mental breakdown and was committed to the Louisiana State Insane Asylum, where he spent the rest of his life. He never recorded a single note. Everything we know about his music comes from those who heard him play and never forgot how he made them feel. Though his voice was lost to time, his spirit became part of jazz's DNA. Musicians like Louis Armstrong would later call him the father of the sound. The way Bolden bent notes, improvised freely, and poured emotion into every breath became the model for generations of players. He was a mystery, a myth, a man who created something immortal with nothing but a cornet, a wild heart, and rhythm all his own. If Buddy Bolden was the wild spark that lit jazz's first flame, Jelly Roll Morton was the one who gave it shape. Born Ferdinand Joseph Lamothi in New Orleans in 1890, he renamed himself Jelly Roll and boldly declared that he had invented jazz. It was a grand claim, but one rooted in real innovation. Where Bolden brought raw passion, Morton brought structure. He didn't tame jazz's spirit, but he gave it form and flow. Jelly Roll was a pianist, composer, and storyteller. As a teenager, he played in bars, brothels, and gambling halls, places where music had to seduce and entertain. He absorbed everything around him: Spanish melodies, ragtime rhythms, Creole folk tunes, and African-American blues. Then he fused them into something distinctly his own. What made Morton remarkable was his ability to write jazz down, to capture its chaos on paper without losing its soul. He created intricate arrangements for multiple instruments, turning what had been spontaneous jams into orchestrated masterpieces. His Red Hot Peppers recordings were not just performances, they were carefully designed journeys full of syncopation, surprise, and swagger. Yet, even in his precision, Morton left space for freedom. He understood that jazz needed both structure and spontaneity, that it thrived in the space between discipline and emotion. He wore his confidence like a costume, dressed in sharp suits, speaking with flair, and calling himself Dr. Jazz. And in 1926, when he recorded Black Bottom Stomp and Dr. Jazz, the world finally began to listen. His sound spread far beyond New Orleans, reaching Chicago and New York, helping to make jazz a national and soon global movement. Jelly Roll Morton didn't just play jazz, he proved it could be art. He showed that it could be written, studied, and remembered without losing its heart. Some say he exaggerated his role in its creation, but even if he didn't invent jazz, he gave it bones, structure, and permanence. Jelly Roll Morton gave jazz its first spine, and yet it still danced. And if jazz had a heartbeat, that rhythm would sound a lot like Louis Armstrong. Born in 1901 in one of New Orleans' roughest neighborhoods, an area known as the Battlefield, Armstrong came into a world of hardship. His father left early, and his mother struggled to provide. As a boy, Louis worked odd jobs to help his family survive. One New Year's Eve, after firing a pistol into the air in celebration, he was arrested and sent to a home for troubled boys. But fate had plans for him there. It was in that home that he discovered the cornet. The moment he played his first note, something awakened. Music became his voice, his way out, his way forward. Louis learned fast. He listened to local players, especially his idol, King Oliver, one of the city's top band leaders. By the early 1920s, Armstrong had joined Oliver's band in Chicago, and his sound stood out immediately, warm, bold, and bursting with life. Unlike many musicians of his time, Armstrong didn't just blend into the band. He rose above it. His solos sang and soared, filled with joy and personality. And when he began to sing with that gravelly, radiant voice, he won the world over. Louis Armstrong brought something new to jazz: personality. He made every solo feel like a conversation, every note like a smile or a sigh. His trumpet didn't just play melodies, it told stories. It laughed, wept, danced, and dreamed. Through Armstrong, jazz found its most human voice, one that would echo around the world and never fade. Louis Armstrong's recordings with his Hot 5 and Hot 7, pieces like West End Blues and Heebie-Jeebies, weren't just performances, they were moments. When he famously dropped his lyric sheet mid-session and slipped into wordless vocals, he helped popularize scat singing and turned it into a jazz staple. His smile, wide, sincere, a little mischievous, became a symbol of the joy this music could bring. Armstrong didn't invent jazz, but he gave it a soul that traveled. He turned a regional sound into a global voice, crossing racial lines and inspiring audiences of every color and age. Where others played notes, Louis told stories. He showed the world that jazz wasn't only music, it was feeling. And no one felt it more deeply or shared it more generously than the kid from the battlefield, trumpet in hand, heart open to the world. As jazz moved north to Chicago, east to New York, and eventually across oceans, New Orleans remained its sacred home. Other cities added their own accents and ideas, but in the Crescent City, the music never became just a genre. It stayed alive, lived, breathed, and shared. In New Orleans, jazz wasn't confined to nightclubs or concert stages. It flowed through neighborhood parades, birthday gatherings, street corners, and most famously, jazz funerals. Those funerals were not simple, solemn farewells. They were emotional journeys that began in sorrow and ended in celebration. A slow, mournful hymn might open the procession, the band playing in minor keys to honor the weight of grief. But after the burial, the rhythm would change. Tempos lifted, horns danced, and the second line, friends, neighbors, and strangers, would follow with umbrellas and steps that turned mourning into motion. That ability to honor pain while embracing joy lies at the heart of New Orleans jazz. Even as the music industry evolved, as jazz gave way to swing, bebop, fusion, and modern forms, New Orleans held tight to its early traditions. Songs passed down by ear, not just through lessons but through living. Children learned by watching uncles and neighbors play on porches. Instruments were shared. Audiences were made of cousins, classmates, and old friends. This wasn't nostalgia. It was legacy, a living thread binding one generation to the next. The music stayed tied to place. Walk through the French Quarter, and you can still hear echoes of what Buddy Bolden might have played more than a century ago. Brass bands march the same streets. Clubs like Preservation Hall keep the old tunes alive, not as museum artifacts, but as voices of the present. In a city shaped by joy and tragedy, by floods and festivals, jazz became the sound that carried its soul. It survived wars, poverty, racism, and disasters because it was never merely something New Orleans created. It was something New Orleans needed, a voice that never stopped singing. Jazz has always been more than music. It is a heartbeat, a protest, a prayer, laughter at the end of sorrow, survival dressed in rhythm. Its sound has shifted with time, but its spirit, the part born on New Orleans streets, has never faded. Over the last century, jazz has traveled far, reimagined in smoky New York clubs, echoing through European halls, blending with hip-hop, rock, and classical. It became a language spoken across cultures, a symbol of freedom, creativity, and soul. And yet wherever it goes, it remembers where it began. It carries the pain, joy, and improvisation that gave it life. At its best, it still says, I will make beauty from whatever I'm given. That spirit lived in Buddy Bolden's cornet, blazing across open fields with no record left behind. It lived in Jelly Roll Morton's piano, shaping the first compositions while leaving space for surprise. It lived in Louis Armstrong's trumpet and voice, breaking barriers and softening hearts. And it lives today in New Orleans parades, in young fingers learning old songs, in second lines that refuse to let grief walk alone. It lives in the hush before a solo, in the swing of a brushed snare, in a saxophone's cry that words can't explain. Jazz endures not because it is perfect, but because it is honest, born from sorrow, shaped by joy, grown through struggle, lifted by hope. It reminds us that music doesn't always need a script. Sometimes the most powerful act is to feel, to improvise, and to keep going. From the cracked sidewalks of New Orleans came something eternal. From sorrow and rhythm came something beautiful. And though names change, instruments shift, and songs evolve, the soul of jazz plays on, softly, boldly, always. The morning of December 7th, 1941 began quietly at Pearl Harbor, a broad naval base along the southern coast of Oahu. The sun rose warm over the Pacific, lighting the water in gentle gold. Palm trees moved in a mild breeze, seabirds drifted overhead, and the great ships of the U.S. Navy sat at anchor, bright in the early light. It was Sunday, a day of rest. Some men slept late, grateful for a slower pace. Others sipped coffee, wrote letters home, or prepared for church. Breakfast clattered in mess halls. A few lucky sailors looked forward to the beach or a trip into town. There was no hint of danger. For all its strategic value, Hawaii still felt far from the wars in Europe and Asia. Life at Pearl Harbor followed its steady routine. Aboard the battleships, sailors scrubbed decks, stood watch, checked rosters, and inspected gear. The Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and others moved with the ordinary hum of a base at work, alive with activity but unprepared for what was coming. On nearby airfields, rows of planes sat exposed in neat lines. No one expected trouble in those early hours. Everything felt normal. But far out over the ocean, a Japanese strike force was already in motion, more than 180 aircraft skimming low, silent, and unseen. Their mission was simple and devastating: deliver a surprise blow that would cripple the United States Pacific Fleet. On the ground at Pearl Harbor, there was no warning, only the familiar scent of salt air, the faint thrum of engines, and the easy rhythm of a Sunday morning. It was a peaceful moment, the last many would ever know. Within an hour, that calm would vanish, shattered by fire, steel, and history. For now, it was just a morning like any other. At 7:48 a.m., the sky changed. Without warning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft swept in from the north. 183 planes in tight formation, fighters, bombers, and torpedo craft roaring low over the water. To those below, it felt sudden and unreal, a sound that did not belong to Sunday. The quiet shattered into machine gun chatter, bomb blasts, and screaming engines. The attackers dove with terrifying precision, striking battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and airfields in carefully timed waves. Sailors scrambled to their stations, some barefoot, half-dressed, pulling on uniforms as they ran. But there was little time. Bombs ripped open decks, torpedoes streaked into hulls. Aircraft fell like thunderbolts from the sky. On the airfields, chaos spread. Planes parked wing to wing became perfect targets for strafing runs and incendiaries. Hangars burned, barracks shattered. Men fired into the air with rifles, desperate and mostly helpless. The USS Arizona took a direct hit to her forward magazine. The explosion was instant and catastrophic. A tower of flame rose into the sky as the ship began to sink, taking hundreds with her. The USS Oklahoma, struck by multiple torpedoes, rolled and capsized in minutes. Trapped sailors pounded on the overturned hull. Some were saved. Many were not. Smoke spread across the harbor, thick and choking. Burning oil slicked the water, igniting as sailors leapt in to escape the flames. Sirens wailed, voices shouted. The assault from above did not stop. The Japanese had achieved total surprise. For those on the ground and at sea, the attack seemed to stretch into forever. In reality, the attack on Pearl Harbor lasted just over 90 minutes, a brief stretch of time that forever changed history. In that hour and a half, a peaceful harbor turned into a battlefield. Ships were torn apart, lives were lost, and the illusion of safety and paradise was shattered. What began as a quiet Sunday morning became a moment written in fire, a turning point the world would never forget. Pearl Harbor had been built as a symbol of strength, a fortress of ships and steel, lined with battleships once thought invincible. But on the morning of December 7th, 1941, that illusion fell apart. The Japanese focused their attack on the heart of American naval power. The Pacific Fleet anchored in the harbor. 8 massive battleships rested quietly on the water, unaware they were seconds from catastrophe. The USS Arizona, proud and towering, was among the first struck. A single bomb pierced her deck and ignited her ammunition magazine. The explosion was so violent that it lifted the ship out of the water before tearing it apart. Flames shot skyward. In an instant, over 1,100 men were gone. Many never identified, many never found. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma was hit by multiple torpedoes. Within minutes, she capsized completely, trapping hundreds of sailors inside. Desperate crews worked frantically with blowtorches to cut through steel and rescue those still alive. Some made it out. 429 did not. Most died in darkness, the rising water closing around them. Other ships, the West Virginia, California, and Nevada, were also struck. Torpedoes tore through their hulls, bombs exploded across their decks, and fires spread with terrifying speed. Crews fought back, but most had no time to prepare. The Nevada, attempting to escape under heavy fire, managed to move toward the harbor entrance before grounding herself deliberately, a heroic act to keep the channel clear for other ships. By the end, 21 vessels were damaged or destroyed, including battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Airfields, fuel depots, and repair stations also burned. The harbor, once a place of order and calm, had become a floating graveyard. Fires raged through the night. The smell of oil and smoke filled the air. Bodies were pulled from the water, many unrecognizable. Oil leaked from sunken ships for days, and to this day the wreck of the Arizona still weeps black tears into the sea. The Japanese strike had been devastatingly effective. The pride of the American Pacific Fleet lay broken at the bottom of the harbor. Not a single Japanese ship was lost. But amid the wreckage, something far stronger than steel had awakened, something that would soon reshape the world. While ships burned and explosions tore through the base, it was the people, sailors, soldiers, nurses, and civilians who bore the true weight of that morning. The attack claimed 2,403 American lives. More than 100 perished aboard the Arizona alone. Most were young men, some barely out of school. They had enlisted in a time of peace and died in a war they never saw coming. Many never reached their posts. Some were still in their bunks when the first bombs fell. Others stayed at their stations, fighting until their ships sank beneath them. Amid the chaos, acts of courage shone everywhere. Sailors carried wounded shipmates to safety, dove into burning water, and manned guns with bare hands and no orders, only instinct and duty. On land, the devastation was just as severe. Civilians and military personnel were caught in the crossfire at airfields like Hickam and Wheeler. Bombs tore through barracks, setting planes ablaze before they ever left the ground. Survivors dragged the wounded from wreckage, turning hangars into makeshift hospitals. With supplies short and chaos everywhere, medical crews improvised. Kitchen tables became operating surfaces. Belts became tourniquets. At the Naval Hospital, doctors worked for hours without pause, their shoes soaked in blood as the flow of the injured never stopped. Then there were the survivors who carried wounds that couldn't be seen. They spoke of the screams that echoed from inside the overturned Oklahoma, where trapped sailors pounded on the steel hull for hours, of shipmates lost to fire and smoke just out of reach. Some were the only survivors from their entire crew. Others lived with burns, shrapnel wounds, or permanent hearing loss. And for many, the trauma of that morning stayed with them for life. Invisible but unending, the destruction of ships could be counted in tons of steel. But the true cost of Pearl Harbor was measured in lives. Lives lost, lives changed, lives that would never be the same. War had come suddenly, and it had come with a terrible price. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not random. It was a carefully planned and precisely executed operation. For months, Japan had been preparing, drawing maps, building models, training pilots, and rehearsing every detail. Japan's leaders believed that war with the United States was unavoidable. Tensions had been building for years. The U.S. had imposed strict economic sanctions, including an oil embargo, in response to Japan's aggressive expansion across China and Southeast Asia. Cut off from vital resources and unwilling to retreat, Japan's leaders saw only two paths: withdraw from their ambitions or strike the United States before it could react. They chose to strike. The goal was clear: to cripple America's Pacific Fleet so completely that the US would have no choice but to accept Japan's dominance in the Pacific. By destroying battleships, airfields, and fuel reserves, Japan hoped to gain 6 months or more to seize the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and beyond, time to fortify its empire before America could recover. The plan was overseen by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant and deeply conflicted strategist. He had studied in the United States and understood its vast industrial strength and willpower. In private, he warned his leaders, saying, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Yet once the decision was made, Yamamoto carried it out flawlessly. On December 7th, 6 aircraft carriers, more than 400 planes, and a fleet of warships sailed over 3,000 miles undetected through the northern Pacific. It was one of the most daring and skillful naval operations in history, and tactically it succeeded. Battleships were destroyed, airfields wiped out, and America caught off guard. But what Japan could not destroy was the American spirit. In trying to crush its enemy's strength, it had instead ignited its determination. The sleeping giant Yamamoto feared had awakened, and the course of history was about to change forever. The hope for negotiation never came. What Japan had expected to be a quick strike leading to surrender became the spark of full-scale mobilization. The attack on Pearl Harbor didn't intimidate the United States. It united it. Instead of weakening America, it forged a strength and determination greater than Japan had ever imagined. Pearl Harbor may have been Japan's opening move, but it was also the beginning of its eventual defeat. The very next morning, on December 8, 1941, America was no longer the same nation it had been just one day before. Across the country, people gathered around radios in kitchens, shops, schools, and factories waiting for answers. They heard the calm, steady voice of President Franklin D. Roosevelt as he addressed Congress, and through them the entire world. His words began with a sentence that would echo through generations. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. For 7 short minutes, Roosevelt spoke with clarity and resolve. He described the deliberate and unprovoked attack by the Empire of Japan and declared that the United States had been thrust into war. Congress responded immediately. The vote to declare war passed with near unanimity, only one voice in opposition. A single day after the attack, America was officially at war. Just 3 days later, on December 11th, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies under the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States. America responded in kind. Within a week, a country that had long debated whether to join the conflict found itself fully engaged in World War II, fighting across both the Pacific and European fronts. The change in mood across the nation was instant. The years of argument between isolationists and interventionists were over. Factories that once built cars began producing tanks, planes, and weapons. Young men lined up at recruitment centers, ready to serve. Families rationed food, collected scrap metal, and planted victory gardens. America had been attacked, and it answered not with fear but with resolve. Roosevelt's speech did more than declare war. It gave the nation a direction. It turned a moment of pain into a call to action, transforming sorrow into unity and purpose. Pearl Harbor was no longer just a harbor. It became a symbol, a reminder of what had been lost, and a promise of what would rise from the ashes. From that moment came a declaration. From the declaration, a war effort, and from that war effort, a rewriting of history itself. Before Pearl Harbor, America had been divided, torn between staying out of foreign wars and acknowledging that the world was descending into chaos. Europe was already burning under Hitler's armies. Japan had invaded China and threatened Southeast Asia. Still, many Americans believed it wasn't their fight. That belief ended in a single morning. The attack on Pearl Harbor silenced debate. Isolation turned to action. America was now fully engaged, militarily, economically, and politically. From that day forward, the United States would play a defining role in shaping the outcome of World War II. Factories roared to life. Assembly lines that once made household goods now produced tanks, rifles, and warplanes. This transformation became known as the arsenal of democracy, a shift that would make the US the world's largest producer of war materials. In time, American industry would outbuild all the Axis powers combined. Millions of young men enlisted, some volunteering the very next day, others drafted soon after. Boys from small towns and big cities alike put on uniforms and were sent across oceans to places they had never heard of: Europe, North Africa, the Pacific. Women stepped into new roles, working in shipyards, factories, and offices. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of this new American spirit, strong, capable, and vital to victory. The government mobilized the home front with rationing programs, war bonds, and massive propaganda campaigns. Science and technology advanced rapidly under the pressure of war. Across the globe, new alliances formed as the US joined Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and others to push back against fascism and imperial aggression. The attack meant to destroy America's power had instead unleashed it. It focused the nation's will and reshaped the world's destiny. A single morning of destruction had awakened a sleeping giant. And from that awakening came a force that would liberate continents and define the next century. For those who survived Pearl Harbor, the war did not end when the bombs stopped falling. In the days that followed, the harbor was quiet again, but it was a haunting quiet. The water that once reflected blue skies now held twisted wreckage and slicks of oil. Burned ships lay half submerged, their decks blackened, their masts tilting toward the horizon. Divers worked tirelessly, not just to salvage equipment but to recover bodies. Some were never found. Survivors carried memories that would stay with them for a lifetime. Many had lost brothers, bunkmates, or best friends, the same men they'd eaten breakfast with only hours before. They had seen ships explode, men leap into flaming water, and entire crews vanish beneath the waves. Some bore burns and shrapnel wounds. Others walked away without a mark, but carried scars that no one could see. For many, the sounds and sights of that morning returned in dreams for years to come. Some never spoke of it again. Others relived it every day. There was guilt, too, the kind that lingers in silence. "Why me?" they asked. "Why was I spared?" These questions had no answers, but they followed survivors long after the war had ended. And yet from their pain came something extraordinary. Many found ways to honor what they had endured. They told their stories. They returned to Pearl Harbor year after year, standing quietly at the USS Arizona Memorial, gazing down into the water where their shipmates still rest. As decades passed, their voices became part of something larger, not just a memory of loss, but a testament to resilience. These men and women, many of them barely adults at the time, carried the story of Pearl Harbor with them into every corner of their lives. Into the families they built, the work they did, the country they helped rebuild. They didn't seek fame. Most never called themselves heroes. But they were. The attack on Pearl Harbor broke something open in the world, but what followed revealed something greater: the power to endure, to rebuild, and to remember. Today, Pearl Harbor stands not only as a military base, but as a place of remembrance. More than 80 years have passed since that morning. Yet the memory remains vivid, preserved in history, retold by generations, and honored by those who still walk its shores. The harbor that once roared with explosions and sirens now lies quiet, its peace broken only by the lapping of waves and the hum of passing boats. At its heart floats the USS Arizona Memorial, a white bridge spanning the rusting remains below. It stands not in grandeur but in reverence. Beneath it lie the remains of more than 900 sailors, still entombed in the ship's hull. It is a sacred silence, one that speaks louder than words, a reminder of sacrifice, unity, and the day that changed the world forever. Drops of oil still rise to the surface of Pearl Harbor, slow, shimmering bubbles that survivors call black tears. They emerge quietly one after another, like a heartbeat beneath the water, a solemn, steady reminder of the lives lost on that fateful morning. Each year, survivors, veterans, families, and visitors from around the world come to this sacred place. They stand in silence beneath the bright Hawaiian sky, reading the names engraved in marble, whispering prayers, or simply bowing their heads as the harbor gently reflects the sunlight. Some toss leis into the water, watching them drift over the resting ships below. Others stand still, listening to the soft sound of waves, the same rhythm that carried echoes of fire and chaos more than 80 years ago. Remembering Pearl Harbor is more than an act of mourning. It's an act of understanding. It reminds us of what was awakened that day, the strength of a nation, the unity of a people, and the resilience of those who survived. As time passes, the number of living witnesses grows smaller. Most of the men and women who were there that morning have now passed on. Yet their voices live on, in letters, in museums, in interviews and classrooms, in the stories grandparents share with grandchildren. The lessons of Pearl Harbor are not just about war. They are about peace, vigilance, and remembrance. They remind us how quickly the world can change, how deeply loss can shape us, and how vital it is to carry history forward, not in anger, but in awareness. December 7th, 1941 was a day of devastation, but from its ashes rose determination. Through remembrance, that spirit continues to guide generations. Pearl Harbor is not forgotten. It is remembered, in silence, in reverence, and in the echo of every name spoken aloud. Long before science, before telescopes and observatories, there were only the skies and the people who watched them. In ancient Babylon, stargazing did not begin with tools or theories. It began with wonder. Night after night, long before clocks or calendars existed, people looked upward. There were no streetlights, no noise, no distractions. The heavens stretched endlessly above them, vast, still, and full of mystery. To the Babylonians, the stars were not distant balls of fire. They were living signs, the movements of gods across a heavenly stage. The sky was sacred, and its shifting lights told stories that echoed on earth. They watched with devotion, believing that whatever unfolded above was a reflection of life below. And though they had no telescopes or technology, their accomplishments were astonishing. With nothing but their eyes and patience, they began to map the sky. They noticed that certain stars rose in the east at the same time each year. They saw the moon follow a pattern, and that Venus would vanish for a time only to return in a predictable cycle. These were not random observations. They were the result of decades, even generations of watching. Knowledge passed quietly from father to son, from priest to apprentice. For them, astronomy was not a hobby. It was a calling. The sky was a clock, a calendar, and a prophecy. Fair's changes dictated when to plant crops, when to worship, when to go to war, and when to celebrate peace. The heavens, they believed, could foretell fortune or famine, the rise of kings or their downfall, so they watched from rooftops, temple courtyards, and towering ziggurats that reached toward the stars. Night after night they charted the heavens, patient and reverent. They had no machines, but they had time. They had stories, and most of all they had faith. Faith that the sky was speaking, and that it was their duty to listen. This was not science as we understand it today. It was the beginning of it. Science born from myth, refined through memory, and driven by an unending desire to understand the rhythm of the universe. In the stillness above the desert, the first astronomers were born. To understand them, we must understand the land beneath their feet. Ancient Babylon lay in the heart of Mesopotamia, between the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates, a cradle of civilization surrounded by contrasts. Lush, fertile fields nourished by irrigation stood beside sweeping deserts and open skies that seemed to stretch into eternity. At night, that sky transformed. Without electricity or city lights, it glowed in breathtaking clarity, a living tapestry of stars. The Babylonians stood beneath it, not as scientists but as dreamers, priests, and storytellers. And with their eyes fixed on the heavens, they began humanity's oldest and most enduring quest, to understand the universe above and the place of humankind within it. Every star, every moon phase, every shift in the movement of the planets was visible and clear. For the Babylonians, the sky wasn't distant or detached. It was present, hanging directly above their world like a vast dome filled with stories, signs, and meaning. This land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers gave rise to one of the world's first great civilizations, rich in language, trade, religion, and law. But beyond their achievements in farming, architecture, and governance, the Babylonians cultivated something deeper, a relationship with the heavens. They believed their gods lived above, crossing the sky in the form of stars and planets. Every flicker, Every shift of light was seen as a whisper of divine intent. The stars became their timekeepers. Calendars were built around the phases of the moon. Seasons were predicted by the reappearance of certain constellations along the horizon. When would the rivers flood? When should the barley be planted? The answers, they believed, were written above. But to them, the stars weren't just clocks. They were omens. If a star disappeared unexpectedly, it could mean war. If Mars burned red near the moon, it might foretell the death of a king. The sky held warnings, and it was the duty of the wise to read them before it was too late. Babylon's wide horizons, slow-flowing rivers, and endless skies invited this way of thinking. There was time to look up. There was meaning in looking up. And so, in the cradle of civilization, between two great rivers and under an eternal sky, a new kind of knowledge began to grow, part science, part faith, and completely bound to the stars. In ancient Babylon, watching the heavens was no simple pastime. It was sacred work, a solemn duty carried out by a chosen few. These were the astral priests, men who stood at the crossroads of science and spirituality. They were called Baru, meaning diviners, religious officials whose role was to interpret the signs of the gods. Among them were those whose gaze turned skyward, night after night, reading the heavens like a divine text. These men were not ordinary priests. Their task required patience, precision, and discipline. They were educated in mathematics, writing, and careful observation. On clay tablets, they recorded everything they saw, etching their findings in cuneiform, one of the earliest known systems of writing. Each tablet contained not only what they witnessed, but what they believed it meant. Every comet, every alignment, every strange shadow on the moon was noted alongside its possible interpretation. To them, the sky was not random. It was deliberate, ordered, a reflection of divine will. The gods were not silent. They spoke through the movement of the stars and planets. The priest's job was to listen, to understand, and to guide kings and people alike. Their readings could determine the course of nations, when to go to war, when to plant crops, when to hold ceremonies. A single celestial event could shape the fate of an empire, yet these priests were also in their own way scientists, though they would never have called themselves that. They charted the rising and setting of stars, tracked the looping paths of planets, and counted the cycles of the moon. Over generations, their careful notes evolved into predictions. They began to foresee when celestial events would recur. What began as observation slowly became understanding. Their work was not done in isolation. It was part of a vast temple network, a system of learning and preservation. Knowledge was passed down like sacred fire, refined and expanded with each generation. In the quiet hours of the night, high atop temple courtyards or on rooftops overlooking the sleeping city, the first astronomers of history watched the stars, not merely with curiosity, but with devotion. They believed that by studying the heavens they were listening to the voice of the divine. In the heart of Babylon, great towers rose above the rooftops, the ziggurats. These were monumental stepped temples made of sun-dried bricks, built to bridge the gap between heaven and earth. To the Babylonians, they were cosmic ladders, symbolic mountains connecting the human and the divine. Each ziggurat was dedicated to a god, a sacred stairway ascending toward the realm of the stars. But beyond their religious purpose, ziggurats served another more practical one. They became the world's first observatories. From their high platforms, away from the fires and noise of the city, priests had an unobstructed view of the night sky. There they stood in silence, recording the movements of stars and planets. The most famous of all was the Etemenanki, the ziggurat dedicated to the god Marduk in Babylon. Ancient texts describe it as soaring hundreds of feet into the air, visible for miles, a beacon in the heart of the city. From those heights, wrapped in robes and shadowed by flickering torches, the priest astronomers worked patiently. They marked the sky, recorded their findings, and stored their clay tablets in the temple libraries below. Each night's sky became a page in an ever-growing story, a record of time itself. Climbing the ziggurat was more than a physical act. It was spiritual. Each step carried the priests closer to the gods, and with it closer to understanding. These ancient observatories were carefully aligned with the movements of the heavens, some oriented to cardinal directions, others to specific celestial events. In Babylon, faith and astronomy were inseparable. Every brick reflected both devotion and discovery. At the top of those sacred towers, humanity took its first steps toward the stars, not just to see but to understand. Night after night, the Babylonian sky came alive with movement. To the ancient stargazers, it wasn't chaos, it was choreography. The heavens danced with purpose, and every motion had meaning. Among all the celestial lights, two stood out above the rest, the moon and Venus. The moon was familiar, ever-changing yet eternal. The Babylonians followed its phases, new moon, crescent, full and waning, over a precise cycle of 29 days. Their calendar was built around it, dictating religious festivals, harvest times, and royal ceremonies. Eclipses fascinated them, not as terrifying omens, but as puzzles to be understood. Over time, they recorded when and where each eclipse occurred, linking them to the moon's position and phase. Through generations of observation, they began to predict them, a remarkable achievement for a civilization with no telescopes, only eyes, patience, and time. Venus, however, was special. To the Babylonians, it was not merely a planet but the celestial embodiment of the goddess Ishtar, the bringer of love, war, and fertility. Venus's brilliance and mysterious cycles captivated them. It appeared as the morning star vanished for days, then returned as the evening star. The priests tracked every appearance and disappearance, counting the days between them. Through this dedication, they discovered that Venus followed a pattern, a cycle lasting 584 days. Their precision was astonishing. With nothing but observation and record-keeping, they mapped the dance of the planets and recognized rhythms that would later shape the science of astronomy. They even noted Mars's strange behavior, how it sometimes seemed to slow, stop, and move backward across the sky. Today we call this retrograde motion. The Babylonians simply called it another sign from the heavens. To them, the sky was alive. Every planet, every flicker of light, every darkened moon told a story. And through centuries of watching, they learned that what seemed like chaos was in fact order, a slow, graceful, divine rhythm. When the full moon dimmed and turned red, others saw fear. But in Babylon they saw understanding, for they had learned the greatest truth of all, that the sky, like time itself, moves in patterns. And those who listen carefully enough can learn to predict the dance of the heavens. By comparing their records over many years, the Babylonians made an extraordinary discovery, a repeating pattern in the timing of eclipses, now known as the Saros cycle. They found that after roughly 18 years, 11 days and 8 hours, the Earth, Moon, and Sun would align once again in nearly the same positions, bringing about a similar eclipse. They didn't know why it worked, not in the scientific sense we understand today, but they knew that it did. And they used that knowledge to predict future eclipses with astonishing accuracy, their forecasts aligning remarkably close to the dates modern astronomy confirms. When the Babylonians recorded an eclipse, they didn't just write down the date. They captured the details, how long the darkness lasted, how much of the moon was shadowed, even how the sky looked before and after. These observations were carved into clay tablets in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing of Mesopotamia. Some tablets even included interpretations. An eclipse on the 14th day of the lunar month might warn of danger for the king. One closer to the beginning of the month might foretell hardship for the people. To them, the sky was not just a calendar, it was a code waiting to be read. That they could predict such cosmic events without telescopes or advanced instruments stands as a testament to their patience, discipline, and devotion. Their understanding wasn't built in a single lifetime. It was the work of centuries, each generation refining what the last had seen. They didn't just admire the beauty of eclipses, they learned their rhythm. And in doing so, they transformed mystery into mastery, turning fear into foresight. If you wish to see the stars as the Babylonians once did, you don't need a telescope, you need a tablet. Buried beneath the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have unearthed thousands of clay tablets. Many are records of trade or royal decrees, but among them are far more timeless inscriptions. The sky itself, written in clay, etched carefully with reed styluses. These tablets describe planetary risings, lunar eclipses, the paths of the sun and the groupings of stars. Though simple in appearance, they represent something monumental, the world's earliest known astronomical records. They weren't created for decoration or storytelling. They were data, precise, methodical, and mathematical. Each mark was part of a long effort to understand the heavens, not just through faith, but through logic. Some of the most famous examples come from the ancient city of Uruk, where tablets dating to the 7th century BCE record the movements of Venus in exquisite detail, its risings and settings, its disappearances, and its return. These records reveal a clear grasp of Venus's cycle and its repeating pattern over time. Even more astonishing was the Babylonians' mathematical sophistication. They used a base 60 system, the same one we still use today to measure hours, minutes, and angles. With it, they calculated time, distance, and the length of lunar months with remarkable precision. Some tablets even contained early formulas, procedural texts for modeling the motions of planets. These were not mere guesses. They were the earliest foundations of scientific astronomy. Today, scholars can match many of the events written on those tablets to real celestial phenomena, eclipses, conjunctions, and planetary alignments that occurred more than 2,500 years ago. But beyond their technical brilliance, these tablets offer something more profound, a glimpse into the minds of people who first decided to write the stars down. They didn't just observe the cosmos, they preserved it. Long after their temples crumbled and their cities fell, their records survived, waiting under layers of earth to be rediscovered. In those fragile clay fragments, the ancient skies are still alive. For the Babylonians, there was no divide between astronomy and astrology. The stars were not just distant objects of study. They were messengers. Each carried meaning, a warning, a blessing, a reflection of divine intent. The sky was not separate from life below, but a mirror of it. They believed the heavens were ruled by gods. The moon, the sun, and the planets were not merely celestial bodies, but divine instruments, the eyes and hands of the gods themselves. Their movements told stories, if one had the wisdom to interpret them. When a planet drifted from its usual path, or an eclipse darkened the moon, it was not just an event in the sky. It was a sign. Perhaps a ruler's fate hung in the balance, or a city's fortune was about to change. To ignore the heavens was to ignore the will of the gods. To record and interpret these signs, Babylonian priests created detailed omen texts, vast collections linking celestial events to earthly consequences. The most famous of these was Enuma Anu Enlil, a monumental series of tablets containing hundreds of such predictions. If the moon is eclipsed on the 14th day, one line warns, the king will die. If Venus rises brightly in the west, another says, there will be peace in the land. These texts guided major decisions. Before a battle, before a royal wedding, before a coronation, the sky had to be consulted. Astral omens could delay wars, cancel ceremonies, or inspire new ones. Yet the Babylonians were not simply superstitious. Their astrology was rooted in evidence. They knew the planets followed cycles. They understood that eclipses returned in predictable patterns. They might not have grasped the mechanics, but they mastered the timing. Their prophecies were built on data, centuries of it. In their world, there was no conflict between belief and calculation. A priest could hold a tablet of numbers in one hand and a list of divine omens in the other, and see no contradiction. Astronomy and astrology were two sides of the same sky, one measuring the heavens, the other giving them meaning, and in that union of science and spirit, they found something powerful, a way to bring order to chaos, to find purpose in the rhythm of the stars, and to understand life itself through the sky above. Today, we gaze at the night sky with telescopes that peer across galaxies. We send satellites to the edge of the solar system, name new worlds, and measure the invisible threads of dark matter. Yet behind every discovery lies something ancient, the same spark of wonder that once guided Babylonian eyes toward the heavens. Though their temples have crumbled and their kings' names have faded, their legacy endures, etched into clay, embedded in the ways we still measure time, and written across the very stars they once mapped. They gave us more than myths. They gave us methods. Their base 60 system still governs how we tell time. Their lunar calendars shape traditions and festivals across cultures. Their eclipse records help modern scientists confirm historical dates with astonishing accuracy. But perhaps their greatest gift wasn't mathematical at all. It was a mindset, the belief that the sky was knowable, that through patience and observation, humanity could begin to understand the universe. They were the first to look up and ask not only what the stars were, but what they meant. They gave voice to the silence of the heavens, and in doing so, they invited every generation after to keep listening. Today, the ziggurats no longer reach for the stars, and the clay tablets rest in museum glass. But the spirit of those early stargazers lives on. In the astronomer who spends long nights tracking a comet, in the child who wonders why the moon changes shape, and in the scientist who still believes there is more to discover. From the land between two rivers, beneath the endless canopy of ancient stars, the Babylonians built a bridge between heaven and earth. And even now, thousands of years later, we still walk that bridge, quietly, curiously, and always looking up.